Letters from Adina. Letter 1. My dear Father, my first duty, as it is my highest pleasure, is to comply with your command to write you as soon as I should arrive at Jerusalem, and this letter, while it conveys intelligence of my arrival, will confirm to you my filial obedience. My journey hither occupied many days. When we traveled in sight of the sea, which we did for 3 days, I enjoyed the majesty of the prospect. It seemed so like the sky stretched out upon the earth. I also had the good fortune to see several ships, which the rabbi informed me were Roman galleys, bound some to Sidon and others into the Nile. And after one of these latter, as it was going to you, I sent a prayer and a wish. Just as we were leaving the seashore to turn off into the desert, I saw a wrecked vessel. It looked so helpless and bulky, with its huge black body all out of the water, that it seemed to me like a great sea monster, stranded and dying. And I felt like pitying it. How terrible a tempest must be upon the sea. I was in hopes to have seen a leviathan, but was not gratified in the wish. The good rabbi, who seemed to know all about these things, told me that they seldom appear now in the middle sea, but are seen beyond the pillar of Hercules at the world's end. At Gaza we stopped 2 days, and from thence we proceeded overland to our destination. The morning of the last day of our journey but one, having lost our way and wandered many hours eastwardly, we caught sight of the sea of Sodom and Gomorrah at a great distance to the east. How my pulse quickened at beholding that fearful spot! I seemed to see in imagination the heavens on fire above it, and the flames and smoke ascending as from a great furnace, as on that fearful day when they were destroyed, with all that beautiful surrounding plain, which we are told was one vast garden of beauty. How calm and still lay now that sluggish sea beneath the cloudless sky! We held it in sight many hours, and once caught a glimpse of the Jordan north of it, looking like a silver thread. Yet, near as it appeared to be, I was told it was a good day's journey for a camel to reach its shores. After losing sight of this melancholy lake, our way lay along a narrow valley for some time, and the next day, on reaching an eminence, Jerusalem appeared, as if risen out of the earth. I cannot, my dear Father, describe to you my emotions on beholding the holy city. They have been experienced by millions of our people. They were similar to your own as you related them to me. All the past, with its mighty men who walked with Jehovah, rushed to my memory and compelled me to bow my head and worship and adore at the sight of the temple, where God once, alas, why does he no longer visit earth in his holy house, dwelt in the flaming Shekinah and made known the oracles of his will. We entered the city just before the 6th hour of the evening and were soon at the house of a relative, Amos, the Levite. I was received as if I had a daughter's claim to their embraces, and with the luxuries with which they surrounded me in my gorgeously furnished apartments. I am sure my kinsfolk here mean to tempt me to forget the joys of the dear home I have left. The Rabbi Amos and his family all desire to be commended to you. He seems to be a man of piety and benevolence, and greatly loves his children. I have been once to the temple. Its outer court seemed like a vast caravanserai, or marketplace, being thronged with the men who sell animals for sacrifice, which crowded all parts. Thousands of doves in large cages were sold on one side, and on another were stalls for lambs, sheep, calves, and oxen, the noise and bleating of which, with the confusion of tongues, made the place appear like anything else than the temple of Jehovah. It appears like desecration to use the temple thus, dear Father, and seems to show a want of that holy love of God's house that once characterized our ancestors. On reaching the women's court, I was sensible of being in the temple by the magnificence which surrounded me. With what awe I bowed my head in the direction of the Holy of Holies. I never felt before so near to God. Clouds of incense floated above the heads of the multitude, and rivers of blood flowed down the marble steps of the altar of burnt offering. Alas, how many innocent victims bleed every morning and evening for the sins of Israel! What a sea of blood has been poured out in ages that have passed! What a strange, fearful mystery that the blood of an innocent lamb should atone for sins I have done! There must be some deeper meaning in these sacrifices, dear Father, yet unrevealed to us. As I was returning from the temple, I met many persons who seemed to be crowding out of the gate on some unusual errand. I have since learned that they were going to see a very extraordinary man, a true prophet of God, it is believed by many, who dwells in the wilderness eastward near Jordan, and who preaches with power unknown in the land since the days of Elijah and Elisha. I hope he is a true prophet of heaven, and that God is once more about to remember Israel. But the days of the prophets have long passed away, and I fear this man is only an enthusiast. Farewell, dear Father, and let us ever pray for the glory of Israel. Your affectionate, Adina. Letter 2. My dear Father, the street in which we dwell is elevated, and from the roof of the house, where I love to walk in the evening, watching the stars that hang over Egypt, there is commanded a wide prospect of the holy city. Yesterday morning I was early on the housetop to behold the first cloud of the day-dawn sacrifice rise from the bosom of the temple. When I had turned my gaze towards the sacred summit, I was awed by the profound silence which reigned over the vast pile that crowned Mount Moriah. The sun was not yet risen, but the east blushed with a roseate purple, and the morning star was melting into its depth. Night and silence still held united empire over the city and the altar of God. I was awe-silent. I stood with my hands crossed upon my bosom and my head reverently bowed. For in the absence of man and his voice, I believed angels were all around in heavenly hosts, the guardian armies of this wondrous city of David. Lances of light now shot upward and across the purple sea in the east, and fleeces of cloud that reposed upon it like barks, catching the red rays of the yet unrisen sun, blazed like burning ships. Each moment the darkness fled, and the splendor of the dawn increased. And when I expected to see the sun appear over the battlemented heights of Mount Moriah, I was thrilled by the startling peal of the trumpets of the priests. 1,000 silver trumpets blown at once from the walls of the temple and shaking the very foundations of the city with their mighty voice. Instantly the housetops everywhere around were alive with worshippers. Jerusalem started as one man from its slumbers, and with their faces towards the temple, 100,000 men of Israel stood waiting. A second trumpet peal, clear and musical as the voice of God when he spake to our father Moses in Horeb, caused every knee to bend and every tongue to join in the morning song of praise. The murmur of voices was like the continuous roll of the surge upon the beach, and the walls of the lofty temple echoed it back. Simultaneously with the billow-like swell of the adoring hymn, I beheld a pillar of black smoke ascend from the midst of the temple and spread itself above the court like a canopy. It was accompanied by a blue wreath of lighter and more misty appearance, which threaded in and out and entwined about the other like a silvery strand woven into a sable cord. This latter was the smoke of the incense which accompanied the burnt sacrifice. As I saw it rise higher and higher and finally overtop the heavy cloud, which was instantly enlarged by volumes of dense smoke that rolled upward from the consuming victim and slowly disappeared, melting into heaven, I also kneeled, remembering that on the wings of the incense went up the prayers of the people, and ere it dissolved wholly, I entrusted to it, dear Father, prayers for thee and me. The evening sacrifice is, if possible, more imposing than that of the morning. Just as the sun dips beyond the hill of Gibeah, there is heard a prolonged note of a trumpet blown from one of the western watchtowers of Zion. Its mellow tones reach farthest ear within the gates of the city. All labor at once ceases. Every man raises his face towards the summit of the house of God. A deep pause, as if all held their breath in expectation, succeeds. Suddenly, the very skies seemed to be riven and shaken with the thunder of the company of trumpeters that rolls wave on wave of sound from the battlements of the temple. The dark cloud of sacrifice ascends in solemn grandeur, and sometimes, heavier than the evening air, falls like a descending curtain around the mount, till the whole is veiled from sight. But above it is seen to soar the pure incense to the invisible Jehovah, followed by a myriad eyes, and the utterance of a nation's prayers. As the daylight faded, the light of the altar, hidden from us by the lofty walls of the outer court of the temple, blazed high and beacon-like, and lent a wild solemnity to the towers and pinnacles that crowned Moriah. There was, however, my dear father, last evening, one thing which painfully marred the holy character of this sacred hour. After the blast of the silver trumpets of the Levites had ceased, and while all hearts and eyes were ascending to Jehovah with the mounting wreaths of incense, there came from the Roman castle adjoining the city of David a loud martial clangor of brazen bugles and other barbarian war instruments of music, while a smoke, like the smoke of sacrifice, rose from the heights of David's fortified hill. I was told that it was the Romans engaged in worshipping Jupiter. Alas, how truly now are the prophecies fulfilled which are to be found in the Lamentations. The Lord hath cast off his altar, he hath given up into the hands of the enemy the walls of her palaces. They have made a noise in the house of the Lord, as in the day of a solemn feast. For these things I weep, my dear father. Nearly 300 years have passed since we have had a prophet, that divine and youthful Malachi. Since his day, Rabbi Amos confesses that Jehovah has made no sign of having heard the prayers or heeded the sacrifices that have been offered to him in his time. I inquired of the intelligent rabbi if it would always be thus. He replied that when Shiloh came, there would be a restoration of all things, that the glory of Jerusalem then would fill the whole earth with the splendor of the sun, and that all nations should come up from the ends of the world to worship in the temple. My conversation with Rabbi Amos, dear father, led me to examine the book of the prophet Malachi. I find that after plainly alluding to our present shame and reproaching the priests for causing the people to stumble, he thus prophesies, Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, and he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. Behold, adds the divine seer, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. These words I read today to Rabbi Amos. Indeed, I was reading them when Rabbi Ben Israel came in to say that he departs tomorrow. The excellent Amos looked grave. I feared I had offended him by my boldness, and approaching him was about to embrace him, when I saw tears were sparkling in his eyes. He took my hand, and smiling, while a glittering drop danced down his snow-white beard and broke into liquid diamonds upon my hand, he said, You have done no wrong, child. Sit down by me and be at peace with thyself. It is too true in this day what the prophet Malachi writeth. O Ben Israel, he said sadly to the Alexandrian rabbi, the priests of the temple have indeed become corrupt, save a few here and there. It must have been at this day the prophet aimed his words. Save in the outward form, I fear the great body of our Levites have little more true religion and just knowledge of the one God Jehovah than the priests of the Roman idolatry. Alas, I fear me, God regards our sacrifices with no more favor than he looks upon theirs. Today, while I was in the temple and was serving at the altar with the priests, these words of Isaiah came into my thoughts and would not be put aside. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord? I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs, or of he-goats. Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. I am weary to bear them. Yea, when ye spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when ye make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Wash you, make you clean, cease to do evil, learn to do well. I have noticed, said Ben Israel, that there is less reverence now in the temple than when I was in Jerusalem a young man, but I find that the magnificence of the ceremonies is increased. "Yes," responded Rabbi Amos with a look of sorrow. "Yes, as the soul of piety dies out from within, they gild the outside. The increased richness of the worship is copied from the Romans. So low are we fallen. Our worship, with all its gorgeousness, is as a sepulchre whitewashed to conceal the rottenness within." You may be convinced, my dear father, that this confession from such a source deeply humbled me. If, then, we are not worshiping God, what do we worship? Not. We are worse off than our barbarian conquerors, for we have no God, while they at least have gods many and lords many, such as they are. Since writing the last line, I have been interrupted by Mary, who has brought to see me a youth, nephew of a noble Jewish ruler, who was slain by the Romans for his patriotic devotion to his country. He dwells near the Gaza Gate with his widowed mother, who is a noble lady honored by all. Between this young man, whose name is John, and Mary, there exists a beautiful attachment which is each day ripening into the deepest emotion. He has just returned from the vicinity of Jericho, where he has been for some days past, drawn thither by curiosity to see and hear the new prophet, who is drawing thousands into the wilderness to listen to the eloquence that flows from his mouth. The young man had been giving Mary so interesting an account of him that she desired me also to be a listener. In my next, I will write you all I heard. Your affectionate and devoted daughter, Adina. Letter 3. My dear Father, this morning, as I was coming from the temple, I noticed a vast pile of edifices crowning the opposite rock, which I was told was the Tower of Antonia. It seemed to frown sternly upon the temple, and upon its battlements glittered at intervals numerous Roman eagles. I had so often heard you relate historical events connected with this celebrated castle that I regarded it with peculiar interest. You seemed to stand by my side as I gazed upon it. The insolence and power of the Roman garrison have made the beautiful walk about the base of the tower almost deserted, but of this I was not aware, and attended only by my Ethiopian slave, Onia, I lingered to admire the splendor of the cloister once surrounding the treasure house of the temple, with its terraces supported by white marble pillars 15 cubits high, when 2 Roman soldiers approached. It was then that I saw I was alone. I drew my veil closely and would have passed them rapidly, when one of them placed himself in my path and, catching hold of my veil, tried to detain me. I left it in his grasp and was flying when the other soldier arrested me. This was in full view of the castle, and at my shrieks the barbarians in the castle laughed aloud. At this crisis appeared a young centurion who was on horseback, coming down the rocky path that ascends the rock of Zion, and shouting to them, he galloped forward, and with his sword put the men to immediate flight and rescued me. In order to escort me safely to the streets below, he alighted from his horse, and leading him by the rein, walked by my side. I confess to you, dear Father, I had not reached the house of my relative before my prejudices against the Romans were greatly modified. I had found in one of them as courteous a person as I had ever met with among my own countrymen, and for his sake I was willing to think better of his barbaric land and people. While I was writing the above, a commotion without drew me to the lattice, which overlooks the street that goes out of the gate to Bethany, one of the most frequented thoroughfares in the city. The sight that met my eyes was truly imposing, but made my heart sink with shame. It was a pageant with banners, eagles, trumpets, and gilded chariots, but not the pageant of a king of Israel, like those which dazzled the streets of Jerusalem in the days of Solomon and King David. Not the triumphant passage of an Israelitish prince, but of the Roman governor, preceded by a cohort of horse. He rode in a gilded war chariot, lolling at his ease beneath a silken shade of blue silk fringed with gold. The horses were snowy white and covered with silver mail and adorned with plumes. He was followed by another body of cavalry, and at the head of them, looking more like a ruler and prince than did the indolent pilot, I beheld the generous centurion who had aided my escape from the 2 soldiers. His eye sought the lattice at which I stood, and I drew back, but not before he had seen me and saluted me. "Certainly, Father, this youth is noble and courteous enough to be a Jew, and should any providence cause us to meet again, I shall try to convert him from his idolatry to serve the living Jehovah." You will remember, dear Father, that I alluded to an excitement that is increasing every day in reference to a new prophet who is preaching in the wilderness of Jericho. For 3 weeks past, several parties of citizens have been to the valley of Jordan to see and hear him, and have so far been carried away by him as to have been baptized of him in Jordan, confessing their sins. Among them is John, the cousin and betrothed of Mary. Upon his return, we saw that his countenance was animated beyond its wont, for he is usually of a sad and gentle aspect, and that his fine eyes beamed with an ardent hope that seemed new-born to his soul. He thus recounted to us his visit to the prophet of Jordan. "After leaving the gate of the city, I soon reached the pretty town of Bethpage, where at the inn I beheld several horsemen just mounting to go in the direction of Jericho. On joining the cavalcade, I learned they were for the most part drawn out of Jerusalem on the same errand with myself. One of them, a wealthy young noble of Arimathea, was actuated by the same holy desire that burned in my bosom, a desire that we might, in the prophet who is called John, discover a man sent from God. The others were bent on commerce, on pleasure, or mere idle curiosity. As Joseph of Arimathea and I rode together, we conversed about the man we expected to see. My companion seemed to believe that he was a true prophet, for being very well read in the scriptures, he said that the 70 weeks of Daniel were now about completed, when the Messiah was to come. I then asked him if he believed that the Messiah, who is to be a prince and king and have dominion from the sea to the ends of the earth, would come in the wilderness, clad in the skin of wild beasts. To this he replied that he could not regard this prophet as the Messiah, for when the Christ should come, he was suddenly to come to the temple, and that we should doubtless first see him there, but that he was greatly in hopes that the prophet we were going to see would prove to be the forerunner, foretold by Malachi. "Those who heard him," said Joseph as we rode into the village of Bethany, "say that he publicly proclaims himself the forerunner of the Messiah. The opinion of the more ignorant who have listened to him is that it is Elijah himself returned to the earth. Others assert that it is Enoch come down from heaven, and not a few believe him to be Isaiah." At this point of the narrative of the cousin of Mary, dear Father, I will close this letter. In my next, I will resume his narrative, for when I have given it to you wholly, I have many things to ask you to which it gives rise in my mind. May the blessing of the God of Israel be upon thee, my dearest Father. Adina.